My name is Alex, and I grew up in a small, quiet town nestled deep in the heart of the countryside. As a child, I spent countless summer days at my grandmother's old, creaky farmhouse. It was a place filled with memories, laughter, and the comforting smell of freshly baked bread. But as the years went by, the once warm and inviting house began to feel different, almost sinister. Grandmother lived alone after Grandpa passed away, and though she aged gracefully, there was something about her that seemed to change with each passing year. Her once warm smile turned into a vacant stare, and her gentle voice grew raspy and cold. I shrugged it off as part of getting old, until one night, I realized there was something far more unsettling at play. I had decided to spend the weekend with grandmother, helping her around the house. It was a chilly autumn evening when I arrived, the wind howling through the trees, adding to the eerie atmosphere. Grandmother greeted me at the door, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "Come in, Alex," she whispered, her voice sending a shiver down my spine. "I've been waiting for you." I entered the house, the familiar smell of herbs and old wood enveloping me. The house was dimly lit, casting long shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. As we sat down for dinner, I couldn't help but notice the strange, almost hypnotic way grandmother moved and spoke. Her eyes, once full of life, now seemed hollow and distant. After dinner, I helped grandmother upstairs to her room. The second floor of the farmhouse was even darker and colder, with only a few flickering candles to light the way. As I tucked her into bed, she grasped my hand with surprising strength. "Alex," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Her grip tightened, and I could see the fear in her eyes. "This house. It's not what it seems. There's something here, something that has been with our family for generations. It's a curse, Alex. A dark presence that feeds on our souls." I tried to reassure her, but the look in her eyes told me she was serious. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, the creaks and groans of the old house echoing through the silence. As the clock struck midnight, I heard it, a soft, almost inaudible whisper. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Alex." My heart pounded in my chest as I got up and followed the voice. It led me to the attic, a place I had always avoided. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, the cold air sent a chill down my spine. The attic was dark, the only light coming from the full moon shining through a small window. In the corner of the attic, I saw it, a figure, hunched over, its back turned to me. It was grandmother. She was muttering something under her breath, a language I didn't understand. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. As I stepped closer, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. "Grandmother?" I whispered. She turned to face me, and I saw her eyes, black as coal, void of any humanity. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and she began to laugh, a sound that seemed to echo through the entire house. "You can't escape it, Alex," she hissed. "The curse is in our blood. It will consume you, just as it consumed me." I stumbled back, tripping over an old trunk. As I scrambled to my feet, the figure of my grandmother lunged at me, her hands clawing at the air. I ran, tearing down the stairs and out of the house, the sound of her laughter following me into the night. I never returned to that farmhouse. The memories of that night haunt me to this day. I still hear her voice sometimes, in my dreams, reminding me that the darkness is always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to claim another soul.
My name is Mark Stevens, and I never believed in the supernatural until that fateful night in the swamp. It was a humid summer evening, and I was deep in the heart of the Louisiana bayou. I had come to this remote place to research the unique ecosystem for my biology thesis. The swamp was alive with the sounds of nature, the chorus of frogs echoing through the dense foliage. I had always found their croaking somewhat soothing, a reminder of the vibrancy of life in these murky waters. As dusk fell, I set up camp near a small clearing by the water's edge. The air was thick with the smell of decaying vegetation and the constant buzz of insects. I pitched my tent, lit a small fire, and prepared to spend the night recording the nocturnal activities of the swamp's inhabitants. Little did I know that this night would be unlike any other. It started with a sudden silence. The usual cacophony of frogs and insects abruptly ceased, leaving an eerie stillness that set my nerves on edge. I glanced around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, but I saw nothing unusual. Assuming it was just a natural lull, I continued my work. Then I heard it. A low, guttural croak that seemed to come from the depths of the swamp. It was unlike any frog sound I had ever heard, deeper and more resonant, almost like a growl. My curiosity piqued. I decided to investigate. I grabbed my flashlight and ventured toward the source of the sound. The beam of light flickered as I pushed through the thick underbrush, my boots sinking into the soft, wet ground. The croaking grew louder, more insistent, drawing me deeper into the swamp. I stumbled upon a small clearing, and there, in the dim light of my flashlight, I saw them. Hundreds of frogs, their eyes glowing an unnatural red, were gathered around a large, gnarled tree. At the base of the tree was a small, murky pond, its surface rippling with movement. The frogs were utterly still, their crimson eyes fixed on the water. The sight sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't look away. Suddenly, the water began to bubble and churn. A massive, dark shape emerged from the depths, rising slowly. It was a frog, but unlike any frog I had ever seen. It was enormous, at least 3 feet long, its skin mottled and slick with algae. Its eyes were a fiery red, matching those of the smaller frogs, and its mouth opened in a wide, menacing grin. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. The giant frog let out a deafening croak, and the smaller frogs responded in unison, their chorus reverberating through the night. The air grew thick with an oppressive sense of dread, and I realized that I was witnessing something ancient and malevolent. As the giant frog advanced toward me, I stumbled backward, tripping over a root and falling hard onto the ground. My flashlight slipped from my grasp and went out, plunging me into darkness. I could feel the ground tremble as the creature approached, its heavy breath hot against my skin. Desperate, I scrambled to my feet and ran, crashing through the underbrush, blind with terror. The croaking followed me, relentless and echoing in my ears. I didn't stop until I reached my camp, my breath ragged and my body trembling. I grabbed my gear and fled, not daring to look back. To this day, I can't explain what I saw in that swamp. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I know the truth. The bayou is home to things far older and darker than we can understand. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the swamp, the giant frog and its crimson-eyed followers are still waiting, their ancient croak echoing through the night.
My name is Daniel Carter, and this is the story of how I encountered the Ghost Raider. It started on a cold October night. I was driving back from a late shift at the local diner, the only source of light being the pale glow of my headlights cutting through the thick fog that rolled over the deserted highway. The radio crackled with static, occasionally sputtering out fragments of an old country song. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but I blamed it on the cold. I had always been fascinated by ghost stories, but I never really believed in them. That was until I saw him. As I rounded a bend, a figure appeared on the side of the road. Dressed in a tattered old leather jacket, he stood motionless, his eyes glowing an eerie red in the darkness. At first, I thought he was just a hitchhiker, but something about him felt wrong. I slowed down, curiosity getting the better of me. As I got closer, I noticed his face was gaunt, almost skeletal, and his breath misted in the chilly air. His motorcycle, a vintage Harley, was parked beside him, looking as ancient and worn as he did. The bike's headlight flickered like a dying candle. "Need a lift?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned his head to look directly at me. My heart pounded in my chest, and a sense of dread washed over me. It was then that I realized I was looking at something not of this world. He climbed onto his bike without a word and revved the engine. The sound was deafening, like the roar of 1,000 angry souls. Before I could react, he took off down the highway, his red eyes leaving a trail of light in the fog. I watched in stunned silence as he disappeared into the night. Shaken, I continued my drive home, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every sound amplified in the stillness of the night. When I finally reached my house, I locked the doors and windows, trying to convince myself that it had all been a trick of the light. But the nightmares started that very night. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the sound of the Ghost Raider's motorcycle echoing in my ears. I saw him in every dark corner, felt his presence lurking just out of sight. My friends and family noticed the change in me, but I couldn't tell them the truth. They'd think I was crazy. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to face my fear. I drove back to the spot where I had first seen him. The fog was even thicker this time, the air colder. I parked my car and waited, my heart racing. Hours passed, and just when I was about to give up, I heard it, the unmistakable roar of his motorcycle. The Ghost Raider emerged from the fog, his red eyes burning with an unholy light. He stopped in front of me, and for a moment, we just stared at each other. Then, in a voice that sounded like the rustling of dead leaves, he spoke. "You cannot escape me, Daniel Carter. Your soul is marked." With that, he vanished into the night, leaving me alone and trembling. I never saw him again after that, but I could feel his presence, always watching, always waiting. I moved away, changed my name, tried to start a new life. But no matter where I go, I know he'll find me. Because the Ghost Raider never forgets. And he never forgives.
My name is Emily Thompson, and this is the story of the most terrifying experience of my life. I had just moved to the city for my first job after college. I found a small, affordable apartment in an old building downtown. It was nothing fancy, but it was close to work and the rent was within my budget. The only downside was that I needed to share it with a roommate to afford it. I found a roommate through a listing online, a quiet guy named Jake. He seemed normal enough, polite, kept to himself, and paid his share of the rent on time. The first few weeks went smoothly. Jake was often out, leaving early and coming home late. When he was around, he mostly stayed in his room. We exchanged pleasantries and occasionally chatted about mundane things like the weather or the latest TV shows. It was an ideal arrangement, or so I thought. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a strange noise. It sounded like whispering, but it was too faint to make out any words. I brushed it off as Jake talking in his sleep, or maybe just the sounds of the old building settling. I pulled the covers over my head and went back to sleep. The next night, I heard it again. This time, it was louder and more distinct. It was definitely coming from Jake's room. I got up and walked over to his door, pressing my ear against it. The whispering continued, low and urgent, like a one-sided conversation. I couldn't understand what he was saying, but it sent chills down my spine. The following day, I decided to ask Jake about it. When he came home, I casually brought it up. "Hey Jake, do you talk in your sleep? I heard some noises from your room last night." He looked at me with an odd expression and shook his head. "No, I don't think so. Maybe it was just the building. This place makes all kinds of weird noises at night." I nodded, trying to convince myself that he was right, but the feeling of unease lingered. Over the next few nights, the whispering continued, growing louder and more insistent. I started to notice other strange things too. Objects in the apartment seemed to move on their own. I'd leave my keys on the kitchen counter and find them on the coffee table. The TV would turn on by itself in the middle of the night, the volume blaring. One evening, I came home to find Jake sitting in the dark living room, staring at the blank TV screen. His eyes were wide and unblinking, and he didn't seem to notice me come in. "Jake?" I called softly. "Are you okay?" He slowly turned to look at me, his face pale and drawn, They don't like you, he whispered. A cold wave of fear washed over me. Who doesn't like me, Jake? Them, he said, pointing to the empty air beside him. They don't want you here. I felt a chill run down my spine. Jake, you're scaring me. Who are you talking about? But he didn't answer. He just got up and walked to his room, closing the door behind him. That night, the whispering was louder than ever. It felt like it was coming from all around me, surrounding me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called my friend Sarah, asking if I could crash at her place for a few days. She agreed, sensing the urgency in my voice. The next morning, I packed a bag and left the apartment. I didn't tell Jake I was leaving. I just couldn't face him. At Sarah's place, I finally felt safe. I told her everything, and she suggested I find a new place to live. I agreed, knowing I couldn't go back to that apartment. A few days later, I went back to pack up the rest of my things. The apartment was eerily quiet. Jake's door was open, but he wasn't there. As I packed, I found a small, old notebook under the couch. Curious, I opened it. The pages were filled with Jake's handwriting, but the words made no sense. It was like he had been writing in some sort of code or another language. The last few pages were different, though. They were filled with frantic scribbles and repeated phrases like, "They are here," and "They don't like her." I felt a chill as I realized he had been writing about me. I quickly finished packing and left the apartment, leaving the notebook behind. I moved in with Sarah temporarily while I looked for a new place. A few weeks later, I heard from the landlord. He told me that Jake had moved out suddenly, leaving no forwarding address. He also mentioned that the previous tenant had left under strange circumstances, too. I never found out what really happened in that apartment or who they were. But I do know one thing. I will never forget the feeling of those eyes watching me in the dark and the whispers that still haunt my dreams.
My name is James Carter, and I'm about to tell you the most terrifying story of my life. It all began at a party where I met a woman who would haunt my dreams and waking life alike. It was a warm summer night, and my friend Dave was throwing one of his legendary parties. His house was packed with people, laughter, and the sound of music thumping through the walls. I was nursing a drink in the corner, trying to relax after a long week at work, when I saw her. She was standing alone by the fireplace, her presence almost magnetic. She was strikingly beautiful, with long, raven-black hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to glow under the dim light. Her red dress clung to her slender frame, and she held herself with an air of effortless grace. I felt a strange pull towards her, an inexplicable need to speak to her. I made my way through the crowd, feeling oddly nervous as I approached. "Hi, I'm James," I said, offering a smile. She turned those intense eyes on me and smiled back, but there was something unsettling about it. "Hello, James. I'm Lila." We chatted for a while, and despite the growing unease in my gut, I found myself captivated by her. She had a way of making me feel like I was the only person in the room, her eyes never leaving mine. But there was an underlying coldness to her gaze, a predatory glint that sent shivers down my spine. As the night wore on, Lila suggested we step outside for some fresh air. I hesitated, but the strange allure she had over me was too strong to resist. We walked out into the garden, the party's noise fading into the background. The moonlight cast an eerie glow over the trees, and the night was filled with the sound of chirping crickets. We found a secluded spot near an old oak tree, and Lila leaned against it, her eyes fixed on me. "You know, James," she said softly, "there's something about you that intrigues me." I tried to respond, but my throat felt dry. There was something about her voice, a hypnotic quality that made it hard to think clearly. She stepped closer, her fingers lightly brushing my arm. "Do you believe in fate?" she whispered. Before I could answer, her expression changed. The predatory glint in her eyes intensified, and her smile twisted into something cruel. I took a step back, suddenly feeling like a prey cornered by a predator. "Lila, I should get back to the party," I stammered, my heart racing. She laughed, a chilling sound that echoed through the garden. "Oh, James, you can't leave now. We're just getting started." In that moment, everything about her changed. Her eyes darkened to an unnatural black, and her beautiful features contorted into a grotesque mask of malevolence. Her fingers dug into my arm with an inhuman strength, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. Panic surged through me, and I yanked my arm free, stumbling back. I turned and ran, the sound of her laughter following me like a shadow. I didn't stop until I was back inside the house, the warmth and noise of the party a stark contrast to the horror outside. I didn't see Lila again that night, but her presence lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling of her eyes watching me, even in the crowded room. I left the party early, my heart still pounding with fear. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. I would catch glimpses of her in mirrors and reflections, her cold black eyes watching me with that twisted smile. My nights were plagued with nightmares of her chasing me, her laughter echoing in the darkness. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, but the fear was too real. I started avoiding mirrors and reflective surfaces, but it was no use. She was always there, lurking just out of sight, a constant reminder of that night. One evening, I was home alone, trying to focus on a book to distract myself. The house was quiet, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and a chill filled the room. I looked up, and there she was, standing in the doorway. Her eyes were black voids, her smile a rictus of pure evil. "You can't escape me, James," she whispered, her voice echoing in my mind. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. "What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice trembling with fear. She stepped closer, her form shifting and flickering like a shadow. "Your fear," she hissed. "It feeds me." I ran to the door, but it slammed shut before I could reach it. I was trapped, my mind racing with terror. She moved closer, her presence suffocating, and I felt my strength ebbing away. In a desperate bid to save myself, I grabbed a mirror from the wall and held it up to her. For a moment, she recoiled, her form flickering and distorting. The sight of her own reflection seemed to weaken her, and I seized the opportunity. I shouted words of defiance, willing her to leave me alone. With a final piercing scream, she vanished, leaving me alone in the now eerily silent house. I collapsed to the floor, my body shaking with relief and exhaustion. Since that night, I haven't seen Lila again, but the memory of her still haunts me, a reminder of the terror that lurks just beyond the veil of our reality. I can only hope that whatever she was, she's gone for good. But deep down, I know that the fear she instilled in me will never truly fade.
My name is Lisa Warren, and I've always had vivid dreams. Sometimes, they're wonderful, fantastical escapes from reality. Other times, they're dark, unsettling experiences that linger long after I wake. But nothing could have prepared me for the nightmare that became all too real. It started on a night like any other. I went to bed early, exhausted from a long day at work. I fell asleep almost instantly, slipping into a dream that felt unusually lucid. In the dream, I was standing in the hallway of my childhood home. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on your ears and makes you acutely aware of every little sound. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoing off the walls. As I reached the living room, I saw someone standing by the window, their back to me. It was a woman with long, dark hair, wearing a white nightgown. She was staring out into the darkness beyond the window. "Mom," I called out, my voice trembling. The woman turned slowly, and I realized with a jolt that it wasn't my mother. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow, black eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. A chilling smile spread across her lips, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I turned to run, but my legs felt like they were moving through thick molasses. The woman's laughter echoed through the house, a low, guttural sound that made my skin crawl. I stumbled and fell, and as I looked up, she was standing over me, reaching out with long, bony fingers. I woke up with a start, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. It was just a dream, I told myself. Just a nightmare. But as I lay there, trying to calm my racing heart, I heard it, a low, guttural laugh, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. It had to be my imagination. Dreams can do that, blur the line between reality and illusion. I took a deep breath and forced myself to get out of bed. I had to prove to myself that it was just a dream. I opened my bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. The house was dark and quiet, just like in my dream. I walked slowly, my footsteps eerily echoing off the walls. As I reached the living room, I saw her, standing by the window, just as she had been in my dream. My blood ran cold. This couldn't be happening. I blinked, hoping she would disappear, but she remained, her dark eyes fixed on me, that chilling smile stretching across her face. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper, my voice shaking. She didn't answer. Instead, she began to move toward me, her feet not seeming to touch the ground. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, but again, my legs felt heavy, as if I were moving through thick molasses. Her laughter filled the house, louder and more menacing. I reached the front door and yanked it open, fleeing into the night. I ran down the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of a well-lit gas station. I turned back, expecting to see her following me, but the street was empty. For the next few nights, I stayed at a friend's house, too terrified to return home. I told her about the dream, about the woman, but she just laughed it off, saying I'd been watching too many horror movies. I wanted to believe her, to think that it was all just a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew the truth. Eventually, I had to go back home. I couldn't avoid it forever. I returned during the day, hoping the sunlight would chase away the shadows that haunted my nights. For a while, things seemed normal. The house was just a house, empty and ordinary. But then, the dreams started again. Every night, I found myself back in that hallway, the woman's black eyes staring at me, her laughter echoing through the house. And every night, I woke up to the sound of her laughter, growing closer and closer. I couldn't escape her, not in my dreams, not in reality. She was always there, watching, waiting. I started to see her out of the corner of my eye, in mirrors, in reflections. She was always just a step behind me, no matter where I went. I don't know how much longer I can take this. The line between dream and reality has blurred beyond recognition. I fear that one day, I won't wake up at all. I'll be trapped in that dream, with her, forever.
My name is Jake, and I'll never forget the night when my friends and I decided to take a different route home from a party. We were trying to avoid the traffic on the regular road, but instead, we found ourselves in a nightmare. It was around midnight when we left the party. My best friend Tom and I were on our bikes, and our friend Lisa was riding with Tom. The night was cool, and the sky was clear. We were in high spirits, laughing and joking as we rode through the empty streets. Tom suggested taking a back road he knew of, saying it would be quicker and less crowded. We all agreed and turned onto the unfamiliar path. The road was narrow and winding, cutting through dense woods. The further we went, the darker it got. The trees seemed to close in around us, and the only sound was the hum of our bike engines. We rode in silence for a while, the eerie atmosphere dampening our spirits. Suddenly, Tom's bike sputtered and died. He tried to restart it, but the engine wouldn't turn over. "Jake, hold on a second," Tom called out. I pulled over and parked my bike, watching as he fiddled with the ignition. Lisa got off the bike and stood by the roadside, looking around nervously. After a few minutes, Tom managed to get the engine running again. We all breathed a sigh of relief and got ready to leave. As I started my bike, I noticed something strange. No matter how much I revved the engine, my bike wouldn't move. It was as if the wheels were stuck to the ground. "What the hell?" I muttered, trying again. The engine roared, but the bike stayed put. "Jake, what's going on?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. Tom walked over to check it out, but there was nothing visibly wrong with the bike. We were stumped and starting to feel a growing sense of dread. Suddenly, I heard a crunching sound. I looked down and saw my bike's number plate crumpling up like it was made of paper. It was being crushed by some invisible force. "Guys, we need to get out of here now." I shouted, panic rising in my chest. Tom and Lisa got back on their bike, and I kept trying to get mine to move. Finally, with a jerk, it lurched forward, and I sped off behind them. We didn't stop or look back until we were far away from that cursed road. When we finally reached a well-lit, busy street, we pulled over to catch our breath. My heart was pounding, and I was drenched in sweat. Tom, Lisa, and I exchanged worried glances. None of us could explain what had just happened, but we all knew one thing for sure: we would never take that route again. To this day, I can still hear the sound of my number plate being crushed. It haunts me, a chilling reminder of the night we ventured onto that forsaken road. We never spoke of it again, but the memory lingers, a shadow over our once carefree friendship.
My name is Emily. When I got accepted into my dream university, I was excited to finally have a place of my own. Little did I know, my new apartment would become a living nightmare. When I first stepped into the apartment, it seemed perfect. The rent was affordable, and it was within walking distance of my university. The building was old but charming, with its creaky wooden floors and vintage fixtures. I liked that. The first few nights were uneventful. I busied myself with unpacking and getting settled. However, things began to change when I found an old, dusty mirror hidden behind the wardrobe. It was ornate and beautiful, with intricate carvings on its frame. I decided to hang it in the hallway. It started with small things. At night, I would hear faint whispers, barely audible, as if someone was murmuring just beyond the walls. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the quirks of an old building. But then, I began to notice shadows moving in the corner of my eye. Whenever I turned to look, there was nothing there. One evening, while I was studying, I felt an icy breeze brush past me, even though all the windows were closed. My breath hitched as I glanced around the room, my heart pounding in my chest. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder. They seemed to be coming from the direction of the mirror. Curiosity got the better of me, and I walked toward it. As I stared into the glass, my reflection began to distort. My face twisted into a grotesque, unrecognizable form. I stumbled back, my heart racing, convinced it was a trick of the light. But when I looked again, my reflection was normal. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers turned into cries, and the shadows seemed to gather around the mirror. I covered it with a sheet, hoping to block out whatever malevolent force was behind it. But the disturbances only grew worse. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They stopped right outside my bedroom door. Holding my breath, I listened, my body frozen with fear. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and a chilling gust of wind swept through the room. I saw a figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and empty. She wore a tattered dress, and her hair hung in tangled, dirty strands. She stared at me, her lips moving silently. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. She raised a bony finger, pointing toward the mirror. The sheet covering the mirror fluttered as if caught in a breeze, and then it was violently ripped away. The glass shimmered, and I saw the woman's reflection within it. She stepped into the room, her movements slow and deliberate. I finally found my voice and screamed, but no sound came out. She reached for me, her fingers cold and clammy against my skin. I woke up the next morning in my bed, drenched in sweat. It had to be a nightmare, I told myself. But the mirror was uncovered, and the room still felt unnaturally cold. I decided I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things and left the apartment that same day. I later found out from a neighbor that the previous tenant had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. No one knew what happened to her, but some believed she had been driven mad by the apartment's haunting presence. To this day, I can't shake the feeling that the mirror still holds a part of her, waiting for its next victim. And every now and then, when I'm alone, I hear those faint whispers, a chilling reminder of the terror I escaped.
My name is Mark. As an avid hiker and nature enthusiast, I often seek out remote locations to explore. One particular trip to a hilly region left me with an experience I'll never forget. The journey began on a crisp autumn morning. I had heard rumors of an old, forgotten road deep in the hills, known as Black Hollow Road. Locals whispered about its haunted history, but I brushed it off as superstition. Armed with my backpack and a sense of adventure, I set off to find it. The drive to the hills was uneventful. The road twisted and turned through dense forests, the vibrant fall colors painting a beautiful landscape. After a few hours, I arrived at a weathered signpost that read Black Hollow Road. It was barely legible, covered in moss and vines. The road itself was a narrow, winding path that disappeared into the dense forest. I parked my car at the entrance and began my hike. The path was overgrown and rugged, the trees towering above like silent sentinels. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves under my boots. As I ventured deeper, an eerie silence settled over the forest. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, unsettling stillness. After an hour of walking, I came across an old, rusted car abandoned by the side of the road. Its windows were shattered, and the interior was overgrown with moss and weeds. It looked like it had been there for decades. A chill ran down my spine as I realized how isolated I was. Continuing on, I noticed the forest growing darker, the trees seeming to close in around me. A thick fog began to roll in, obscuring my path. The atmosphere grew heavy, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I kept walking, my heart pounding in my chest, when I heard it, a faint, distant wailing sound. It was barely audible, but it sent a shiver through me. I quickened my pace, hoping to find an end to this forsaken road. The wailing grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like someone in pain, their cries echoing through the fog. Panic set in, and I broke into a run. The road seemed endless, twisting and turning with no clear direction. Suddenly, I stumbled upon an old, dilapidated house. It was barely standing, its walls crumbling and roof caved in. The wailing was deafening now, emanating from within the house. Against my better judgment, I approached the front door, which hung loosely on its hinges. As I stepped inside, the temperature plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I could see my surroundings clearly despite the fog outside. The interior was in shambles, furniture overturned and debris scattered everywhere. The wailing seemed to come from the basement, a dark stairway leading down into the depths of the house. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, but something compelled me to continue. I descended the stairs, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The wailing grew louder, more agonizing. At the bottom, I found a small, dimly lit room. In the center was an old rocking chair, and in it sat a woman. Her appearance was ghastly, her skin pale and translucent, her eyes hollow and filled with sorrow. She rocked back and forth, her mouth open in a silent scream. The wailing was all around me, but her lips did not move. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to look away from her haunting gaze. Suddenly, the wailing stopped. The silence was deafening. The woman's eyes locked onto mine, and she whispered, "Leave this place." Her voice was barely audible, but it echoed in my mind. I turned and fled up the stairs, out of the house, and down the road as fast as I could. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. Gasping for breath, I looked back at the entrance to Black Hollow Road. The fog had lifted, and the forest was silent once more. I drove away, vowing never to return. To this day, I can still hear the wailing in my nightmares. The memory of that haunted road and the ghostly woman in the rocking chair haunts me, a chilling reminder of the terror I encountered in the hills.
My name is James, and I want to share a story about my dog, Max, and how he saved me one night. Max is a loyal German Shepherd, and we've been inseparable since he was a puppy. We have a routine of taking a walk every evening, and that night was no different, or so I thought. It was a clear evening, with a light breeze in the air, as Max and I walked down our usual path near the old cemetery. The moon was bright, and everything seemed peaceful. But Max, usually full of energy and curiosity, was acting differently. He was alert, his ears standing straight up, and he let out a low, unusual growl. "What's up, Max?" I asked, feeling a bit uneasy. Max tugged on his leash, pulling me toward the cemetery gates. I hesitated, but his insistence made me follow. As we walked through the gates, Max's growl turned into a bark. He was clearly trying to warn me about something. I looked around, trying to see what had caught his attention. That's when I noticed a man standing by one of the tombstones, staring at us. He looked lost and confused, and something about him didn't feel right. Max stood between me and the man, barking loudly. "Hello? Do you need help?" I called out, but the man didn't respond. Instead, he started walking toward us, his movements slow and unsteady. Max barked even louder, and I could feel my heart racing. Just as the man got closer, Max lunged forward, pulling me back and breaking my concentration. The man stopped, seemingly startled by Max's aggression. He turned around and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Max had sensed something was wrong before I did, and he had protected me. I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me as I patted Max on the head. "Good boy, Max. Let's go home." As we walked back home, I couldn't shake the feeling that Max had saved me from something dangerous that night. Since then, I've trusted Max's instincts even more. He's more than just a pet. He's my protector. A few days later, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to visit the cemetery during the day. I found the tombstone where the man had been standing. It was old and weathered, with a name I didn't recognize. I asked around the neighborhood and learned that the man buried there had died under mysterious circumstances many years ago. Some said his spirits still wandered the cemetery at night. The story sent a shiver down my spine, but it made me appreciate Max even more. That night, he had sensed something beyond my understanding and kept me safe. Max continues to be my loyal companion, always looking out for me. We still take our evening walks, but I steer clear of the cemetery. Max seems more relaxed now, and I trust his instincts implicitly. He's not just my dog, he's my guardian, always watching over me. And so every night as I look at Max curled up by my side, I'm reminded of how he protected me. It's a bond that's grown even stronger, built on trust and a shared experience that neither of us will ever forget.
My name is Mark, and I want to tell you about an experience I had on Mount Everest that changed my life forever. As an avid mountaineer, I've always been drawn to the allure of Everest, the highest peak in the world. Little did I know that my last expedition would take a turn that I could never have anticipated. We started our climb early in the morning, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The air was crisp and thin, each breath a reminder of the altitude we were facing. Our team consisted of experienced climbers, each of us determined to reach the summit. We made our way through the Khumbu icefall, navigating the treacherous crevasses and towering seracs. As we ascended higher, the weather began to change. Dark clouds rolled in, and the wind picked up, howling through the mountains like a haunting wail. We decided to set up camp for the night, hoping the storm would pass by morning. The temperature dropped significantly, and we huddled together in our tents, trying to stay warm. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The howling wind outside sounded almost like voices, whispering unintelligibly. I chalked it up to my imagination and exhaustion, but a nagging feeling of unease settled in my gut. Around midnight, I heard a faint, eerie sound. It was like someone calling my name. I unzipped my tent and peered outside, my headlamp cutting through the darkness. There, in the distance, I saw a figure standing on the ridge. It was too dark to make out any details, but the figure seemed to be waving at me. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was seeing things, but the figure remained. My heart pounded in my chest as I called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" There was no response, just the relentless wind. I considered waking up my team, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I decided to investigate on my own, thinking perhaps someone was lost and needed help. I put on my gear and stepped out into the freezing night. As I approached the ridge, the figure seemed to move away, always staying just out of reach. I followed, driven by a strange compulsion. The snow crunched under my boots, and my breath formed icy clouds in the air. Suddenly, I slipped and fell, sliding down a slope and crashing into a snowbank. Dazed, I looked up and realized I was in a part of the mountain I didn't recognize. Panic set in as I tried to get my bearings. The figure was gone, and I was alone in the dark, disoriented and freezing. I fumbled for my radio and called for help, but all I got was static. The wind seemed to whisper my name again, louder this time, almost mocking me. I turned around, desperate to find my way back to camp, when I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints in the snow, leading away from me, but they weren't human. They were larger, deeper, and had an odd elongated shape. I followed them, hoping they would lead me back to safety. The footprints led to a small cave, hidden by an overhang of ice. With no other option, I ventured inside. The cave was dark and narrow, but I could see a faint light at the end. As I moved closer, the light grew brighter, revealing carvings on the walls. They depicted scenes of ancient rituals, strange creatures, and climbers from different eras. My heart raced as I realized these were stories of people who had disappeared on Everest over the years. At the end of the cave, I found a small shrine with offerings of old climbing gear, photographs, and personal items. The light emanated from a small, flickering lantern. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned around to see the figure from the ridge, now close enough for me to see its face. It was an old Sherpa, his eyes filled with sorrow. He pointed to the shrine and then to me, as if trying to communicate something important. I was too scared to move, but then he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "The mountain takes what it wants. Leave an offering, and you may survive." Trembling, I took off my lucky charm, a pendant my father had given me, and placed it on the shrine. The Sherpa nodded and vanished, leaving me alone in the cave. The whispers faded, and I felt a strange sense of calm. I found my way out of the cave and followed the footprints back to camp. When I returned, my team was relieved to see me. They had been searching for me for hours. I told them what had happened, but they were skeptical, thinking it was just a result of exhaustion and altitude sickness. But I knew the truth. Everest is more than just a mountain. It's a living, breathing entity with its own will. It takes what it wants, and sometimes shows mercy. I left a part of myself on that shrine, and in return, I was spared. I still climb, but I'll never forget the shadows on Everest and the night it almost claimed me.